I want to think carefully about one of the most unexamined words in the entire language, which is the word job. It is a word that carries an enormous amount of emotional and moral weight. Getting a job is presented as the mark of arrival into adulthood. Losing one is presented as a small catastrophe. Having a good one is presented as the reasonable ceiling of a reasonable life. And because the word is surrounded by so much emotion, so much social expectation, so much accumulated meaning that we absorb long before we are old enough to examine it, most people never actually stop to ask what a job is at the structural level, beneath all of the associations, as a specific kind of economic arrangement with specific properties that produce specific and largely predictable outcomes. I am not going to make a moral argument about work. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because this is a subject where people immediately reach for the extremes, and the extremes are both wrong. I am not going to tell you that work is beneath you, that ambition means despising the ordinary, that everyone should quit tomorrow and start a company. That is the tone of the motivational industry, and it is a shallow and often destructive tone that has separated a great many people from their savings and their stability without giving them anything durable in return. And I am equally not going to tell you the opposite, the comfortable version, the version that says a steady job is the whole answer, that if you simply work hard and stay loyal and manage your expenses, wealth will accumulate on its own. That version is also false, and it is false in a way that is more damaging precisely because it feels responsible. What I want to do instead is look at the structure, because when you look at a job structurally, when you strip away the emotional coloring and ask what is actually happening in the arrangement, you begin to see why it produces the outcomes it produces, and why those outcomes almost never include the accumulation of genuine wealth, no matter how diligent or intelligent or hardworking the person inside the arrangement happens to be. The failure is not a failure of the person. It is a property of the structure. And once you see the structure clearly, a great many things that were confusing become obvious, and a great many decisions that were difficult become simple. So let me begin with the most basic observation, which is also the one that is most consistently overlooked. A job is a rental agreement for your time. That is what it is. You are renting out a fixed quantity of your hours at an agreed rate to someone who has decided that those hours are worth more to them, combined and organized and directed toward their purposes, than the rate they are paying you for them. The entire arrangement rests on that gap. The employer would not hire you if your labor were not worth more to the enterprise than your wage. That surplus, the difference between what your hours produce and what you are paid for them, does not accrue to you. It accrues to the owner of the enterprise. That is not exploitation in any dramatic sense. It is simply the mechanism. The owner takes the risk, provides the capital and the structure, and in exchange keeps the surplus that the organized labor produces. The worker takes the wage, which is stable and predictable and disconnected from the surplus, and in exchange gives up any claim on the upside. Now, the moment you see a job as a rental agreement for your time, several of its structural properties become immediately visible, and each of them matters enormously for the question of whether the arrangement can ever produce wealth. The first property is that it is linear. Your income from a job is your hours multiplied by your rate. That is a simple multiplication, and simple multiplication does not produce wealth. It produces income, which is a very different thing. You can raise the rate through skill, through negotiation, through moving to a more valuable role, and this helps, but it helps linearly. A person who doubles their hourly value has doubled their income, which sounds significant until you notice that doubling is a one-time event that requires enormous effort and that cannot be repeated indefinitely. There's a ceiling on the rate set by what the market will pay for that category of labor, and there is a much harder ceiling on the hours set by the fact that a human being has a fixed and quite small number of hours available and needs a significant fraction of them simply to remain alive and functional. Hours multiplied by rate is an arrangement with a ceiling built into both of its terms. The second property is that it does not compound. This is the property I want to sit with, because compounding is the single most important concept in the accumulation of wealth, and a job is structurally incapable of it. Compounding requires an asset that grows on its own accumulated base so that the returns themselves begin to generate returns, and the growth accelerates over time even when the input remains constant. A job has no such base. Your salary resets to zero at the start of every pay period. You're paid, you consume or save the wage, and then the meter starts again from nothing. The hours you worked last year do not make the hours you work this year more valuable on their own. There is no accumulating base of labor that begins to generate labor. Even the raises, which feel like growth, are linear additions rather than compounding multiplications. The person who is optimizing their salary is optimizing a variable that by its nature cannot compound and is therefore optimizing the wrong thing, no matter how successfully they optimize it. And the third property is that it is not owned. You do not own your job. You do not own the surplus it produces. You do not own the enterprise you are helping to build. You own the wage, which is yours, but the wage is the smallest and least valuable part of the arrangement, because the wage is the part that has been deliberately capped and stabilized and disconnected from the growth. Everything that grows in the arrangement, the enterprise, the surplus, the compounding value of the organized labor over time belongs to someone else. You are inside a compounding machine, contributing to its compounding, and you are structurally positioned to receive none of the compounding. I want to draw a distinction here that I think is the most important distinction in this entire subject, and it is the distinction between wages and wealth. These two words are used almost interchangeably in ordinary conversation, as though earning more is the same as becoming wealthy, and the confusion between them is responsible for an enormous amount of misdirected effort. Wages are what you are paid for, showing up and renting out your time. Wealth is what you own that earns while you are not showing up, that produces value while you sleep, that continues to generate returns whether or not you are present. These are not 2 points on the same scale. They are two different kinds of thing entirely. A person with a very high wage and no assets is not wealthy. They have a high income and a structural dependency, and if the income stops, which it can, the entire edifice of their apparent prosperity stops with it. A person with modest wages and a genuine ownership stake in productive assets is on a different trajectory entirely, because the assets are working even when the person is not, and the assets can compound and the wages cannot. The system, and by system I do not mean anything conspiratorial, I mean simply the set of institutions and incentives that organize modern economic life, is extraordinarily good at converting your time into wages and almost entirely uninterested in converting your time into wealth. This is not because the system is malevolent. It is because the system is optimized for its own functioning, and its own functioning requires an enormous supply of organized, reliable, predictable labor, and it obtains that labor by offering wages, which are exactly the instrument that keeps a person functioning and contributing without ever accumulating the ownership that would allow them to leave. The wage is calibrated, not consciously by any individual, but structurally by the market, to be enough to retain you and rarely enough to free you. This is the quiet mechanism at the center of the whole arrangement. You are paid enough to stay and not enough to leave, and the gap between those two amounts is precisely the surplus that flows to the owners. So if a job cannot produce wealth because it is linear and does not compound and is not owned, then the natural question is what does produce wealth? And the answer, the genuine answer beneath all of the specific tactics and strategies, comes down to a small number of principles that are old, that are well understood by the people who have actually built durable wealth, and that are almost never taught in the institutions that prepare people for jobs, for the simple reason that those institutions exist to produce workers rather than owners. The first and most central of these principles is leverage. Leverage is the thing that breaks the linear relationship between effort and output. A person without leverage is limited to what their own two hands and their own finite hours can produce. A person with leverage produces output that is disconnected from and vastly larger than their personal labor. And there are historically three forms of leverage, and understanding the difference between them is understanding a great deal about how the distribution of wealth has changed over time and where the genuine opportunities are now. The oldest form of leverage is labor, other people working under your direction. The person who commands the labor of 100 people produces the output of 100 people while contributing the direction of one. This is the leverage of the manager, the general, the traditional business owner. It is real leverage and it is powerful, but it is also the most difficult and least pleasant form because managing human beings is genuinely hard, and because it requires permission, the willingness of those people to follow, and it scales badly and breaks easily. The second form is capital, money working on your behalf. The person with capital can deploy it into ventures and assets that generate returns without any further labor from the person. This is the leverage of the investor, and it is enormously powerful and it compounds beautifully, but it has a decisive limitation, which is that you generally need to already have capital or already have the credibility to be trusted with someone else's capital in order to use it. Capital leverage is the form that most obviously favors those who already have wealth, which is why it has historically been the engine by which existing wealth perpetuates and concentrates itself. And then there is the third form, the newest form, the one that has genuinely changed the landscape in a way that most people have not fully absorbed, and that is the leverage of products with no marginal cost of replication. Code and media. This is the leverage of an army of robots that work for you day and night for free once you have built them. A piece of software that solves a real problem can be copied 10 million times at essentially no additional cost, and each copy works for you without any further input of your labor. A piece of writing, a video, a body of recorded thought can reach 10 million people while you sleep and reach 10 million more the next day without you doing anything further. This is leverage that requires no permission from anyone. You do not need to be given capital. You do not need people to agree to follow you. You need only to build something genuinely useful once, and then the replication is free and permissionless and works while you are not present. This is the great democratization of leverage. And it is the reason that the specific historical moment we are in is one in which the path from ordinary circumstances to genuine ownership is more open than it has been in a very long time. For the people who understand what has changed, these principles, the way leverage and ownership and specific knowledge compound into a durable economic position rather than a merely comfortable income, are worth studying deliberately and systematically rather than absorbing in fragments. And there is a body of work that lays them out carefully called the Naval Codex, CTA 1. It is not a financial plan, and it is not a collection of tactics. It is a systematic account of the underlying principles that determine who builds genuine long-term wealth and who merely earns income that cycles through their hands without ever accumulating into anything. If you are serious about these questions, engaging with the principles directly is more valuable than any single specific answer, because the principles outlast the particular circumstances in which you happen to apply them, and the circumstances will always change. Now, leverage by itself is only half of the equation, because leverage multiplies whatever it is applied to, and if it is applied to something ordinary, it produces ordinary results at scale. The thing that leverage must be applied to in order to produce genuine wealth is a second principle, which is specific knowledge. And specific knowledge is a concept worth defining precisely, because it is frequently misunderstood as simply meaning expertise, and it means something more particular than that. Specific knowledge is the knowledge that cannot be trained. It is the knowledge that, if it could be taught in a straightforward way through a course or a manual, would already have been taught to someone cheaper, who would then be doing the work for less. It is highly technical or creative knowledge that sits at the edge of what is currently understood, that is acquired through genuine curiosity and genuine obsession rather than through formal instruction. And that feels, to the person who has it, more like play than like work, which is exactly why they were willing to invest the enormous quantity of attention required to acquire it. Other people look at them doing it and see work, difficult and admirable work. But the person doing it experiences it as the thing they cannot stop doing, the thing they would do anyway, the thing their particular nature draws them toward. That gap between what looks like work to others and feels like play to you is the signature of specific knowledge. And it is the reason specific knowledge is so difficult to compete away, because you cannot pay someone to have your particular obsessions. A job by its nature is a poor environment for building specific knowledge and an impossible environment for owning its returns. It is a poor environment for building it because a job rewards you for performing known, defined, repeatable tasks reliably, which is the opposite of the exploratory, curiosity-driven, edge-of-the-known activity through which specific knowledge is actually acquired. And it is an impossible environment for owning the returns, because even in the rare case where a job does allow you to build something genuinely specific and valuable, the value belongs to the enterprise, not to you. You built it on their time, with their resources, and the surplus it produces flows to the owners. You are permitted to build specific knowledge in a job only to the extent that the enterprise can capture its value, which means precisely to the extent that you cannot. Which brings me to the third principle, the one toward which the other two have been pointing, which is ownership. You do not get genuinely wealthy by renting your time. You get genuinely wealthy by owning a piece of something that grows. Equity, a stake in an enterprise or an asset that compounds, whose value increases over time on its own accumulated base, and that continues to produce value whether or not you are personally present. This is the mechanism. There is no other mechanism. Every genuinely wealthy person, without exception, owns things. They may also earn wages, but the wages are not the source of the wealth. The ownership is the source of the wealth. The distinction between a salary and equity is the distinction between the part of the arrangement that is capped and the part of the arrangement that compounds. And the system routes the ordinary person relentlessly toward the salary and away from the equity, because the salary is predictable and controllable and keeps the person contributing, while the equity is where all of the growth is, and the growth is what the owners are keeping for themselves. There is a further principle that sits alongside ownership and makes it possible, and that is accountability. The market pays for accountability. It pays for the willingness to attach your name to something, to take on the genuine risk of being wrong in public, to accept the downside as well as the upside. The reason a business owner captures the surplus is precisely that they have accepted the accountability. If the enterprise fails, they lose. They have put their name and their capital and their reputation on the line, and the market compensates that acceptance of risk with the right to the upside. A job is, in a sense, the purchase of the removal of accountability. You accept a capped and stable wage precisely in exchange for not bearing the risk. That is a genuine trade, and for many people at many stages of life, it is a reasonable one, but it is important to see it clearly for what it is. When you choose the stability of a wage, you are choosing to sell your accountability, and the price of your accountability is your claim on the upside. You cannot have the stability and the upside simultaneously. The one is purchased with the other. Now I want to widen the lens, because everything I have described so far is true in any era and would have been true 50 years ago and 500 years ago. The distinction between wages and wealth, between renting time and owning assets, between the worker and the owner, is one of the oldest structural distinctions in all of economics. But there is a set of forces operating in the present moment that makes the arrangement worse for the wage earner than it has been in living memory, and that most people who are inside the arrangement have not fully registered, because the forces operate slowly and beneath the surface and are easy to explain away in any given year. The first of these forces is monetary. We live in a debt-based monetary system in which the supply of money expands over time and expands particularly rapidly in response to crises, of which there is always eventually another one. This expansion has a specific and profoundly unequal effect, and it is an effect that falls almost entirely on the wage earner and the saver, and almost entirely benefits the owner of assets. When the money supply expands, the new money does not distribute itself evenly. It flows first into assets, into equities and real estate, and the things that owners own, bidding up their prices. Wages, by contrast, are sticky. They rise slowly, they lag, they are the last thing to adjust. So the person who owns assets watches the nominal value of their holdings rise with the monetary expansion, more or less keeping pace with it, while the person who holds only their wage and their cash savings watches the purchasing power of both quietly erode because the wage rose slower than the prices and the cash did not rise at all. This is not a dramatic event in any single year. A 2 or 3% erosion is barely perceptible month to month. But sustained over the decades that matter for a life, it is an enormous transfer, a continuous and silent flow of purchasing power away from those who hold wages and cash and toward those who hold assets. The saver is diligently doing what they were told was responsible, and the monetary system is quietly diluting them the entire time, and they experience the result as a vague and unexplained sense that things are harder than they should be, that the money does not go as far as it used to without ever quite locating the mechanism. The way capital actually moves during these monetary shifts, where it flows and why it flows there, what happens to different kinds of assets when the monetary order itself begins to change, is worth understanding in its specific mechanics rather than in vague outline. And there is a framework that traces exactly this, called the Dragon Pivot. CTA2. Despite the name, it is not really about any single country. It is about how monetary transitions unfold historically, what they do to different asset positions, and how people who understood them in advance have positioned their wealth to survive the discontinuity rather than be diluted by it. If the dynamics I am describing concern you, and I think for anyone holding their wealth primarily in wages and cash, they genuinely should, that is where the fuller historical picture lives. The response to this monetary reality is not to earn a higher wage, because a higher wage is still a wage, still denominated in the currency that is being diluted, still sticky and lagging and structurally on the wrong side of the expansion. The response is to move from holding wages and cash to holding assets, to cross the line from the side of the system that is diluted to the side of the system that is carried along by the expansion. And this brings me to the question of which assets, because not all assets are the same, and the distinction between the kinds of assets matters more in the current environment than it did in calmer times. There's a distinction I want to draw between assets whose value is fundamentally a financial claim on a system that is under structural strain, and assets whose value is grounded in genuine productive capability that is relatively independent of any single system's trajectory. A savings account, a bond, a claim denominated purely in the currency is a financial claim on the monetary system, and its real value rises and falls with the management of that system, which, as I've described, is being managed in a way that erodes such claims. But equity in a genuinely productive enterprise is a different kind of thing. A business that produces something real, that solves a genuine problem for genuine customers, that generates genuine cash flow from genuine economic activity, has a value that is grounded in its productive output, and its productive output continues regardless of the monetary environment. When the currency is diluted, the business simply raises its prices along with everything else, and the real value of the ownership stake is preserved because it was never merely a claim on the currency. It was a claim on the real productive activity, and the real productive activity is what retains value across monetary changes. Intellectual property has the same character. A body of genuinely useful, creative, or technical work that generates ongoing licensing or royalty revenue, software that continues to solve a real problem, writing or media that continues to reach and serve an audience. is an asset whose value is grounded in genuine usefulness rather than in a financial claim on a strained system, and its value is therefore more durable than any purely monetary instrument. Carefully selected real property, in a place with genuine rule of law and genuine ongoing demand from real economic activity, has the same property. In each case, the crucial thing is that the value is grounded in something real, something productive, something that generates genuine value in the world, rather than in a paper claim on a system whose managers have every incentive to dilute the claim. The work of distinguishing genuinely productive assets from merely financially engineered ones, and of building a position out of real productive capability and real institutional protection rather than out of paper claims on a strained system, is worth doing systematically rather than reactively. And there is a framework devoted precisely to that called the Sovereign Vault, CTA 3. It is concerned with building durable, generationally significant wealth, grounded in things that produce real value, rather than in the financial engineering that looks like wealth in favorable conditions and reveals itself as something else entirely when conditions turn. For anyone who is serious about building something that survives a genuine transition, rather than merely riding a favorable moment, that is the fuller treatment of the question. Now, there is a second force operating in the present moment, alongside the monetary one, and it is one that is transforming the value of a job in real time, faster than most people inside jobs have registered, and that is the arrival of artificial intelligence as a genuinely capable performer of cognitive labor. For most of history, the cognitive tasks that make up the substance of most jobs, the analysis, the drafting, the organizing of information, the routine application of trained expertise, were things that only human beings could do, and so they retained value, and a person who could do them reliably could rent that capability for a wage. That is now changing, and it is changing quickly. Artificial intelligence is becoming genuinely competent at exactly the kind of cognitive labor that can be fully articulated, that can be reduced to text and structured process, which is to say, at exactly the kind of labor that most jobs consist of. And as it becomes competent at that labor, the market value of a human being's ability to perform that same labor falls, because there is now a cheaper and faster and tireless alternative. This is the crucial point, and it connects everything I have been describing. Artificial intelligence commoditizes the very thing a job sells, which is articulable cognitive labor, while simultaneously amplifying the very thing that produces wealth, which is genuine specific knowledge deployed through leverage and ownership. The person who has built genuine specific knowledge, the deep, tacit, hard to articulate judgment that comes from real obsession and real experience, and who owns productive assets that the new tools amplify, is having their output multiplied by these tools, is becoming dramatically more productive, is capturing more value than ever. And the person whose income depends on renting out commoditizable cognitive labor is watching the market value of that labor fall as the tools that can do the same thing proliferate. The gap between these two positions is not widening slowly. It is widening quickly. And it is widening precisely because the same technology that undermines the wage earner amplifies the owner. The job is becoming structurally weaker at the exact moment when the tools for building ownership are becoming cheaper and more accessible than they have ever been, which means the window in which an ordinary person can cross from one side of this divide to the other is genuinely open and is also genuinely finite. I want to turn now to the question that I think is actually the hardest one, harder than any of the analysis, which is why, given that all of this is true and given that it is not even secret, the principles are old and widely available to anyone who looks. Why do the overwhelming majority of people remain inside the arrangement, renting their time, optimizing their wages on the diluted and commoditized side of the system for their entire working lives? Because the failure to act is not a failure of information. The information is available. The failure is something else. And understanding what it is matters more than any of the analysis, because you can understand the analysis perfectly and still never act on it. And most people do exactly that. The first reason is the sheer power of the predictable paycheck as a psychological anchor. There is a genuine and deep comfort in knowing that on a certain day, a certain amount will arrive reliably, regardless of what happened that month. That predictability is worth a great deal to the human nervous system, which is calibrated to fear uncertainty far more intensely than it desires gain. The path of ownership offers no such predictability. In the early years, it offers, quite often, nothing at all. No external validation, no reliable arrival of funds, only effort poured into something whose returns are entirely deferred and entirely uncertain. And the nervous system, faced with the choice between the certain modest wage and the uncertain deferred ownership, reaches almost automatically for the certainty and calls the reaching prudence when a significant part of what is actually happening is simply the avoidance of the discomfort of uncertainty. The second reason is social proof, which is one of the most powerful and least acknowledged forces in a human life. The overwhelming majority of the people around you have jobs. Your parents likely had jobs. Your friends have jobs. The entire visible social world is organized around the assumption that a job is what a person does. And to step outside that assumption is to step outside the visible consensus of the people whose regard you depend on. And human beings are exquisitely sensitive to the regard of their group, far more sensitive than they are to abstract arguments about compounding and leverage. To pursue ownership rather than a wage is to invite, quite reliably, the incomprehension and sometimes the quiet disapproval of the people around you, who experience your choice as a strange and risky deviation from the obvious path, and who will express that experience in 100 small ways that are genuinely difficult to withstand. The person who acts on the analysis must be willing to be, for a time, incomprehensible to the people whose regard they value, and this is genuinely hard, harder than the analysis makes it sound, and it is where a great many people who understand everything perfectly nonetheless stop. And the third reason is the difficulty of delayed gratification across the long time horizons that ownership actually requires. This is where I want to return to the idea of compounding, because compounding has a psychological shape as well as a mathematical one, and the psychological shape is the reason so few people benefit from it. Compounding produces almost nothing that is visible in the early period. The person who begins building genuine specific knowledge, building the products, building the ownership, building the reputation, and the relationships that are the foundation of a compounding asset, sees in the first year, and often the second and the third, results that are laughably small relative to the effort invested. The curve is nearly flat at the beginning. All of the visible action, all of the steepness, all of the reward that makes the whole thing obviously worthwhile arrives later, after the base has accumulated enough that the returns begin to generate returns, and the growth becomes nonlinear. And the tragedy, the specific and common tragedy, is that the flat early period is precisely where the impatience is greatest and the evidence of progress is smallest. And so this is exactly where most people quit. They abandon the process during the flat part, before the compounding has had time to become visible. And then, quite often, they begin again somewhere else and abandon that too during its flat part, and repeat this cycle through an entire working life, never once allowing any single trajectory to run long enough for the curve to bend upward and reveal what was being built all along. This is the deepest reason the system produces the outcomes it produces, and it is why I said at the beginning that the system is not a conspiracy. It does not need to be. It only needs to offer the certain wage, surround you with others who have taken it, and rely on the ordinary human difficulty of enduring the flat early years of anything that compounds. Those three forces, the comfort of predictability, the pull of social proof, and the difficulty of delayed gratification, are sufficient on their own to keep the overwhelming majority of intelligent, capable, hardworking people on the side of the arrangement that cannot produce wealth for their entire lives without any coercion at all. The gate is open, Most people simply do not walk through it because walking through it requires enduring exactly the things that human beings are least equipped to endure. Leverage. It always comes back to leverage and to the willingness to accept the specific discomforts that acquiring it requires. What separates the person who builds genuine wealth from the person who merely earns a good income is almost never intelligence and almost never information and almost never even opportunity, because opportunity in the current moment with permissionless leverage, more available than ever, is genuinely abundant. What separates them is the willingness to move from the rented time to the owned asset, to build the specific knowledge that leverage can multiply, to attach their name and accept the accountability that the market rewards with upside, and above all, to endure the long, flat, early period of compounding without abandoning it in the face of uncertainty and social incomprehension and the daily temptation of the certain wage. These are not complicated principles. They are difficult principles, which is a different thing. The difficulty is not in understanding them. The difficulty is in living them. And so I want to end not with an exhortation, because exhortation is the tone of the very industry I distrust, but with something quieter, which is simply an invitation to see the arrangement clearly. This is, in the end, the oldest distinction in all of economics. The distinction between those who own and those who rent their time, dressed in the specific circumstances of the current moment, sharpened by a monetary system that dilutes the wage earner, and an emerging technology that commoditizes exactly the cognitive labor a wage sells. It is not new. It is one of the most durable patterns in the entire history of human economic life. And it is visible, once you know to look for it, in every era and every society. The novelty is only in the specific pressures of this moment and in the specific historically unusual openness of the path from renting to owning, an openness created by the arrival of leverage that requires no permission from anyone. I am not telling you to quit your job. That would be its own kind of shallow advice. And for most people, at most stages, the wage is what funds the very transition I'm describing, the stability from which the ownership is patiently built on the side. What I am telling you is to see the job for what it structurally is. A rental agreement for your finite time, capped and non-compounding and unowned, and to understand that no amount of diligence inside that arrangement will ever transform it into wealth, because the arrangement is not built to produce wealth. It is built to produce the reliable labor that the system needs, and to compensate that labor with exactly enough to retain it and never quite enough to free it. And then, having seen it clearly, to begin quietly and patiently, and on whatever scale your circumstances allow, to build the thing the job will never give you, which is ownership of something that grows while you sleep. Begin early, endure the flat years, attach your name, apply leverage to genuine specific knowledge, and let the compounding do over a long enough horizon what no wage ever can. The difference between a life spent renting time and a life spent owning assets is not made in any single dramatic decision. It is made slowly in the accumulation of many small choices to stay on the side of ownership. And then, at some point that is impossible to predict in advance, it is made suddenly when the curve that was flat for so long finally bends, and the thing you were building all along becomes, at last, unmistakably visible.